This is the chili pepper, perhaps the single ingredient that's had the most explosive influence on global cuisine since it first caught a ride aboard a trading ship 500 years ago. From China to India, Europe to Southeast Asia, this simple fruit, and yes, it's actually a berry, has added spice to old recipes, inspired sauces and condiments, and spawned an almost religious devotion from its dedicated fans. We know the story. Chilies came from the Americas and spread in the Columbian Exchange, but it turns out there's so much more to it than that. The path of the chili pepper tells the story of nothing less than modern history, of trade and migration, cultures, and, of course, cuisine. And it's a story that's all but unknown. So today we're in Bangkok on the trail of history's spiciest conquest, the path of the chili pepper.
Oh God. I just dipped my fork in and it was more than enough for me.
This is amazing.
This is a place called Ba Chao Jungle Food, and it might be the spiciest restaurant in all of Bangkok. It's a unique place that doesn't feel like it's part of one of the world's biggest urban areas, in an old wooden structure overlooking empty fields and banana farms. Here, what's served is the food of the central Thai jungles, as you might have guessed from the name, and specifically from the countryside around Kanchanaburi. It's a place that in the bustle of Bangkok feels so peaceful that it almost lulls you into a false sense of security. But then you try the food.
No! Oh!
Was that a no as in no, I don't have any more on my spoon, I need more?
Oh my God, no, it's... Oh. How do you save yourself from the spice after? Not water, what do you do?
Keep eating. You get used to it.
No,
and then in 2 or 3 years, you'll be completely used to this and it won't be an issue.
Here at this restaurant, we had 3 dishes. A so-called jungle curry made with chili, fresh black pepper, and wild boar. A dry curry made with chili, venison, tree basil, and kaffir lime. And an omelet for Daria. Now, we came here all the way to the outskirts of the city because there's a very good chance that this, or something like it, is the oldest spicy food here in Thailand. I mean, that's not much of a leap. The technique of taking whatever can be hunted, farmed, or foraged and boiling it together into a stew, well, that's about as primitive as it gets, and there are examples of this kind of dish found by historians and archaeologists pretty much everywhere. In the Americas, the Indian subcontinent, and northern Africa. And all those dishes from all those places, well, they have something else in common. The chili pepper used to add heat to Thailand's spiciest dishes is a varietal known around the world as the bird's eye chili, and it comes from a specific species of peppers called Capsicum annuum. And as it happens, it's the exact same plant from the same common ancestor as Mexico's jalapenos, India's Kashmiri chilies, and even Europe's sweet bell peppers. But here's the thing. Thai jungle curry actually uses 2 kinds of chilies that both grow wild in the mountains, and the second one from a different species altogether. Well, that's cousins with the same stuff found in the Middle East, the Philippines, and southern Africa. So how is it possible that an ancient Thai dish from the most remote parts of the jungle happens to use 2 unique strains of chili peppers that apparently have nothing in common? Well, to tell that story, we have to go back to the beginning. All the way back to the days when there was something else that was coveted for providing food with heat. It's a nursery rhyme that every American student learns practically from birth. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And it's pretty well known why he took off to the west across the Atlantic. He was looking for a route to India, and specifically he was looking for spices. Now, when we think of the stuff the Spanish crown was after, we imagine the exotic bounty of the Asian continent, cloves and nutmeg and cardamom, and while that's all true, sending Columbus in a big boat with a big crew was not cheap, and this was a business decision. So what he was really after was black pepper. Now, pepper originates in India, specifically along what's called the Malabar coast, and it was treasured in Europe ever since becoming a favorite of the Roman Empire. There's a book written almost 2,000 years ago called De Re Coquinaria, which translates to On the Subject of Cooking, and it might be the definitive guide to ancient Roman recipes. And in that book, almost everything uses black pepper as a seasoning. The spice was so valued in Rome that when the Visigoths attacked the city in the year 410, they demanded black pepper as a ransom. After the fall of Rome, it would stay in vogue in what's now Italy, and its trade would finance the rise of the city-states known as Venice and Genoa, which happens to be the birthplace of Columbus. Now, one side note just for fun, it does bear mentioning that black pepper probably shouldn't have been quite as expensive as it was, but the ancient Indian traders seem to have concocted some wild stories to drive up the price. Like claiming that the reason the peppers were black was because they grew in a fiery cave that would burn any who entered except only a chosen few, or any of a bunch of other fabrications to pretend that this common plant was actually quite exclusive, and it's really not that unlike how commerce still works today. But I digress. Anyway, the point is, in the old days, salaries might have been paid in salt, but pepper, that was known as black gold. And that's more than anything else what Columbus was looking for when he charted a course for the West. Now, the Europeans weren't the only ones who valued black pepper. By the time of the Romans, the plant was already well established in Southeast Asia, utilized by the Siamese, and especially in the Khmer Empire, where they bred a varietal called Kampot pepper that was renowned across the region as far back as the 1200s. In fact, it doesn't really matter, but it's still pretty interesting. It's quite possible that black pepper in the ancient world was much more common in Southeast Asia than it was in its home of India, where it would be exported in bulk, but many ancient recipes preferred something else, a plant called the long pepper. Anyway, the point is, black pepper is what Ferdinand and Isabella really wanted when they dispatched Columbus on his mission. But Christopher Columbus, well, we all know the story. He bumped into a different continent altogether, but he didn't seem to realize that, so he'd call the indigenous people Indians, a name that still somehow sticks around even though it's more than a little bit problematic. But to defend Columbus, there was no GPS back then, and since he thought he was in India, then it does make sense that when he landed and dined on local foods and found that everything was seasoned with something hot and spicy, he assumed it must be what he was looking for. And because of that, not only do we know why he loaded his boat with chilies on his very first return to Europe, but also why it got its name, the chili pepper. Now, alright, before we continue, let me quickly explain why we started this mission in the first place. It actually came from a question from a viewer several months ago who asked how chilies first got to Thailand, and I didn't know the answer, so I started to dig. I ordered a few books and tracked down some college dissertations, and this turned into a rabbit hole that's actually been a side project for quite a while. Here in Thailand, and honestly in most of the world, chilies are something we take for granted. It's impossible to imagine Thai green curry, Malaysian sambal, Ethiopian doro wat, or even Italian fra diavolo without heat. Maybe Christopher Columbus didn't know where he was or what he'd found when he landed in the Caribbean and loaded up his ship with what he'd call peppers. But in a way, just as significant as discovering a new continent, what he brought back to Europe would change the entire world. With almost every ingredient, scientists can follow genetic evidence and find at worst a rough point of origin. But with the chili pepper, it's not that simple, and it varies depending on which PhD you ask. According to archaeologists, the first appearance of chili peppers comes about 6,000 years ago in Ecuador, where the DNA was found at a dig site. Linguists trace the first oral references to chilies to that same time period in Oaxaca, Mexico, where the word ají is the first known to refer to a chili pepper. And botanists say the point of origin has to be the jungles between Brazil and Bolivia, where by far the largest biodiversity can be found within the species. Now, as much as I'd love to organize some kind of weird scientific cage match, the truth is they're all kind of correct. And the reason is because of how the plant first spread. See, chilies taste spicy because of a chemical compound called capsaicin, and it's basically created to keep the plant from being eaten by predators who can't stand the heat. But one species of land animals are immune to capsaicin, and it just happens to be the species with the longest range of travel. And those, of course, are birds. And that's why it's likely that chilies really do come from all over South and Central America, because birds would eat the fruit, then drop the seeds everywhere, and wherever the climate was right, they'd grow. By the time permanent civilizations emerged, it isn't impossible for chilies to be found all across the region, including in Ecuador, Bolivia, Brazil, and even the West Indies, where Columbus first landed. But what is absolutely certain is that no ancient society took advantage of the flavor as much as those who resided in what's now Mexico, where chilies were not just a part, but the biggest part of the ancient local cuisine. It's said that chili peppers were the most important ingredient used by both the Aztecs and the Mayans. Both civilizations used chilies in just about everything: food, drinks, dessert, even medicine, as the Aztec cure for almost everything was supposedly a mixture of corn and chili. The whole Mark Wiens thing, what is it, if it's not spicy, I'm not eating? Well, it's very possible that somebody said those same words 1,500 years ago in the Mayan language, although it might have sounded a little bit different. Now, I'll admit that if we really want to show the pre-Columbian brilliance of Mexican cuisine, the best place to do it probably isn't Bangkok. But I mean, we've had the channel for a year and we've never filmed at a Mexican restaurant, so let's just call this an excuse. And anyway, Daria was still hungry after watching me eat all the jungle curry, so the least I could do was get the girl some cheese dip. All right, let's go back to the Americas in the years after Columbus's first arrival and focus at least for a moment on two rival European kingdoms, the Spanish and the Portuguese. Now, the Spanish, as we already mentioned, were the first to reach the territory, and in the years after Columbus's first expedition, Spain set out to claim as much of the land as possible, from North America almost to Antarctica, plundering gold and silver and bringing everything, including chilies, back to the motherland. The Portuguese would arrive in the New World in 1498, and they'd also come for the resources, but their aims were not to conquer so much as to build an empire of global trade. And with that goal in mind, Portugal would establish colonies and trading posts all across the world. The same year as their first ships landed in the Americas, the Portuguese would colonize Mozambique, then Brazil 2 years later, Muscat, Oman in 1508, Malacca in 1511, and between 1502 and 1535, much of the west coast of India. Each of these locations would serve as kind of a way station, a transit hub for anything coming from the New World, including, of course, chili peppers. Now, the Portuguese brought their cargo from Brazil, and the chili that they spread was not the same species as the one Columbus had tasted, the one that would become Thailand's bird's eye chili. The Brazilian chili pepper was a species known as the Capsicum frutescens, and its spread mirrors the growth of the Portuguese Empire. It shows up in Mozambique, where it's called peri-peri, as in peri-peri chicken, and India, where it's the most common strain across much of the South. And by the way, that pepper would also find its way to the United States, where it's called the Tabasco. So if this chili spread everywhere because of the Portuguese, and it's not the same species as Thailand's bird's eye chili, then how did that one spread? Well, the Portuguese might have taken their cargo to the coastal colonies, but the Spanish packed their own ships with Mexican chilies and brought them back to Spain. And from there, Those varietals would take their own path to the east by land, following the footsteps of something called the Silk Road. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later, but the point is, during the years of the Columbian exchange, as the world got smaller and trade got faster and everything spread everywhere, the two paths taken by chili peppers, to the south from Brazil and to the north from Mexico, well, they would take over almost the entire world before their paths would intersect. And where that would happen is the very same place where this story first began, on the Malabar coast of India. So, all right, bear with me for a second because we're not quite done with the age of exploration. In 1497, 4 years after Columbus returned from the New World, a Portuguese sailor named Vasco da Gama would chart a course to the south, succeeding where Columbus failed, finding an ocean route from Europe to India. 3 years later, another Portuguese explorer named Pedro Álvares Cabral would be the one to plant the country's flag in Brazil, and then, using Vasco da Gama's maps, he'd continue straight on for India, sailing past the Cape of Good Hope. Cabral first tried to settle in Calicut, but his men were quickly massacred, so he headed further south. And within a few weeks, Portugal had their first permanent trading post in India in the city of Kochi. Now, already 2 years into his voyage and fresh off the disaster at Calicut, Cabral unloaded everything in the ship's hold and made a hasty retreat, or, since this was 500 years ago, a very slow retreat back to Portugal. Now, thanks to the ship's diaries, we know that Cabral's fleet, or whatever was left of it, reached Kochi on December 24th, 1500. And it's almost certain that that would be the exact day that chili peppers first appeared on Asian soil. A Christmas Eve miracle, at least for people who like really spicy food. Now, over the next 4 decades, the Portuguese would expand their empire to cover much of India's west coast. And as their ships continued to arrive carrying goods from the Americas, overland traders also showed up via the Silk Road carrying Spanish-harvested chilies. And in the kitchens of India's incredible cooks, well, that's where we see the different strains and varietals start to come together, with the peppers from Brazil and Mexico mixing and matching with the best spices from across Asia, and cuisine everywhere would never be the same.
Of all the ways to start a day, jungle curry followed by Mexican food is cheese dip is it's an interesting test for the system. And now we're on our way for India.
To this day, the diversity of both the strains and uses of chilies in the west and south of India are unmatched almost anywhere on Earth. In Kerala and Tamil Nadu, and notably in the state of Gujarat, where the overland Silk Road intersected with the Portuguese sea trading colony in the city of Diu. And modern Gujarati cuisine features endless types and forms of chilies, sometimes all combined into the very same dish.
And we all have something that, you know, for some people, you always hear the stories about like when the Beatles played the Ed Sullivan Show, and you know, a young, you know, Bruce Springsteen or Neil Young is watching this and says, "This is what I want to do with my life," you know, and you know, for me, it's this dish. This is the thing that I tried that put me in some crazy. Wow, I did not know life could be that intense. You know, that extremes became that extreme. And so I moved to China, and I learned how to cook, and I learned how to make this, and I learned how to make a lot more than this, and I ended up, you know, in that industry, and I'm still in that industry, and I'm still in Asia, and I'm still trying to find those highs in the food world, and now that's what we're doing with this channel. But you know, if there were no chilies, if there was no heat, if there was no Sichuan Latzi, I'm most likely still a sports broadcaster in Virginia. And there's no OTR. Or there is an OTR, but it's eating waffles. I don't know.
All right, I've told the story before on the channel, so I won't linger on it too much, but this is the dish that made me move to China and become a cook. La Ji, or Sichuan spicy chicken. At its best, a mountain of dried chilies heaped onto a plate of crispy marinated chicken, garlic, ginger, and Sichuan peppercorns, which it's worth mentioning in this story is actually not a pepper at all, and believe it or not, is part of the citrus family. Anyway, growing up in the States, I'd never tried real spicy food. I mean, actual knock you on your ring of sweat on the forehead kind of stuff, the kind of things that in the best Asian traditions actually still retains just a phenomenal amount of flavor, with the chilies bringing out the taste instead of covering it up. Now, this dish is significant in the path of the chili because it brings us to another explanation of why they spread so effectively. And that's because unlike most foods brought from the New World, chilies didn't have to be sold fresh. They could be dried and shipped almost anywhere for almost any length of time. It's hard to pinpoint exactly how and when chilies first came to China, but most historians guess it was in this dried form, quite possibly dried and carried by Silk Road traders coming from India by way of the Central Asian plateau, or brought from markets in southern trading cities like Motama and Ayutthaya. But it's all kind of just a guess because the parts of China where chilies would first take hold, Sichuan, Hunan, Yunnan, and Guizhou, well, those are mountain provinces, agricultural areas far from the wealthy strongholds of Beijing and Guangzhou. To the Chinese elite, chilies were peasant food, something eaten in the poor villages to mask the tastes of bad food, unlike the delicate and fresh stuff eaten by the upper class. Now, we know for a fact that chilies were in China by the year 1591 because that's when the first written reference appears, in the city of Hangzhou, but that was written as more or less a curiosity by an eccentric playwright. It's not until the 1790s when chilies start to show up in recipe books. To the elite, chilies were, well, they were something. They called them fanjiao, or foreigner pepper. And it's thought that Chao Tianjiao, the famous Chinese heaven-facing chili, was actually developed as an ornamental plant, displayed as a decoration in the homes and gardens of the rich, but eaten by the poor. Chilies in China were given derogatory names, things like chicken heart or goat horn peppers, names meant to imply that they were eaten only by farmers. And it would stay this way until 1949 when the communists took over and Mao Zedong, himself a farmer from Hunan, swept to power using slogans like, "Without chili peppers, there would be no revolution," and "He who cannot endure spicy peppers must be unable to fight." This division, the old biases of the elite against the fiery tastes of the workers, is why there's so much confusion in China about where and when the chilies first arrived. The peasant farmers weren't writing the cookbooks, and the people who were didn't use chili peppers. But it doesn't mean that chili peppers weren't there. And that, finally, brings us back here to Thailand. Now, the main questions we set out to answer were when did chili peppers first arrive in Thailand and how did they go on to spread through Asia? And it turns out there is an answer to at least the first part of that question. In 1511, Portugal established a colony at Malacca in today's Malaysia under the command of Alfonso de Albuquerque, the governor of Portuguese India. Like all of Portugal's Asian possessions, Malacca was intended as a trading port, and one of Albuquerque's first moves was to send an emissary to build a relationship with Ayutthaya. Now, I won't spend too much time talking about the results because, we did an entire video on that topic. But suffice it to say, a close relationship would quickly form, and in 1512, the first trading boats would fan out from Malacca to parts of Southeast Asia, to Java and Sumatra and Ayutthaya, carrying goods sent by the Portuguese from the New World by way of India, including, of course, chili peppers. We also know that the volume of trade sent on this route to Ayutthaya was enormous, primarily because the city became the hub for Chinese merchants, who would travel south, fill their wagons with goods, and bring them back by land, and that's why it's often speculated that the Chinese first brought their chili peppers from what's now Thailand. Now, the one thing we don't know is whether the Siamese actually ate the stuff when it got here. Because just like in China, all we really have to go on from that era is the stuff that was written in the palace. And the first reference in writing to any kind of chili in Thailand comes as recently as the 1800s, when it shows up in a poem by the great Suntorn Pu, who wrote of a dish made of chili and venison. And I know this sounds crazy, but that's probably this, more or less exactly. Now, since the years of Suntorn Pu in the era of Rama II, we can paint a pretty accurate picture of the growth and evolution of Thai cuisine. And in the first 20 years after Columbus sailed the ocean blue, we know more or less when, how, and why chili peppers hitched a ride from the New World to the Far East. But between 1512 and the 19th century, what became of the chili peppers in Asia is kind of a mystery. Well, kind of. We do know that chilies reached Ayutthaya along more than one path. The most famous Thai chili, the bird's eye, is genetically linked to the first chilies brought from Mexico by way of Spain, Europe, and the Silk Road. And the other famous Thai chili, what's called prick chi fa, well, that one comes from Brazil through the Portuguese on the water through Mozambique and India. Assuming China is any indication, and there's no reason to believe otherwise, rural Thai cooks started using the peppers to season their foods. I mean, it's too entrenched in the local cuisine not to believe that this must be true, especially as it's so easy to grow and they take so well to the climate. It's most likely that chili peppers slowly worked their way across Thailand from at least 3 separate directions. From the south, where it spread through Malaysia from the port at Malacca. From Ayutthaya, where it was brought by the Portuguese traders and then planted in the countryside in places like Kanchanaburi, the home of today's jungle curry. And from the northwest along the Silk Road, taking hold in the Lan Na Kingdom and the regions close to Myanmar and China. In fact, chilies, by the time palace writers recorded them even existing, seemed to be everywhere, all at once. Now, in the years between the Columbian Exchange and the modern era, well, we might not know the whole story in Asia, but we do know what happened with chili peppers in Europe. And it's so dumb that I have to get it in here, if you'll please indulge me one last story. Now, it's not that chili peppers weren't accepted at all on the European continent. The Spanish incorporated them into some dishes, and the Hungarians in particular loved the stuff. They used it in their own dishes and actually went as far as to dry the chilies, grind them into a powder, and export that with their own Silk Road traders. That powder, by the way, would be known by the Hungarian word for pepper, paprika, and it's been sold since as early as 1569. Now, here's the ridiculous part. There's a story that's pretty common about why chilies did eventually become absorbed into mainstream European cuisine. According to that story, the folks in France and Germany found New World chilies too spicy for their palate, so botanists set to work on developing a milder varietal. As farmers bred and crossbred peppers trying to take out the heat, their chilies kept getting sweeter and sweeter, and unexpectedly, bigger and bigger. Within a few generations, they had something that was both enormous and extremely hollow. Inside, there were no seeds, just a big empty pepper with that piece that hangs down inside called the stigma. And when the peppers would blow in the wind, they'd make such a loud noise from that piece banging against the outside that they sounded like bells, hence bell pepper. And these peppers, they were so loud that when a storm would come, their ringing would startle livestock, causing stampedes, and nobody ate the stuff because it was too dangerous to farm them. According to the legend, a botanist named Gregor Carillon finally invented a silent sweet chili in the 1920s, and the rest, as they say, is history. Now, it's such a great story that it's sad that it's complete nonsense. But in the last decades, it's been repeated as fact by way too many people, including professors and major YouTube channels. And like nobody even noticed that the scientist's name is literally a musical instrument made from bells. Anyway, it is true that it took a long time for a sweet chili to be bred that would appeal to most Europeans, and that wouldn't really spread widely until the early 20th century. And by then, the same continent that brought those peppers to the world was late to the party, because they were everywhere. In North, South, and Central America, in Africa and India, in China and Southeast Asia, and everyone made this incredible plant into whatever fit their own palate. Today, in Asia alone, there are more than 4,000 unique strains of chili peppers, and of the world's 7 largest producers, 6 are on this continent, with India, Thailand, and China 1, 2, and 3. Here you can find chilies smoked, stuffed, pickled, and even distilled. You'll see it in sauces, spice rubs, and marinades, boiled into soups and ground into curries. It's served on royal menus and at the humblest street carts, and in all corners of the continent, from South Korea to Sri Lanka. It's a miracle plant that can be sold fresh or dried, planted in a wide range of climates and temperatures, and can adapt to selective breeding so well that it can suit any palate. There's no wonder why the chili pepper found its way across the world. Or maybe it was just spread by birds. Subscribe to the channel for more from OTR. Thank you so much to everyone who supports us on Patreon. It really keeps us going. Check the links below for social media, and we'll see you next week.
Like, for example, like what's the Goombah in Florida, is it? That like, you basically, when you use some river animal spice, or not, the curry, you use a lot of spices because they don't taste good. Not Goombah, what is it? I don't know, when you make like the alligator or something.
Gumbo, that's the word you're thinking of.
Yeah.
Goomba?